The entire courtroom erupted in laughter. Judge Edward Lancaster leaned forward, his gavel resting lazily in his hand. His cold blue eyes scanned the defendant, an old, frail-looking man in a wheelchair. His uniform was neatly pressed, but time had worn it thin. His medals, once symbols of honor, now seemed like mere ornaments in the eyes of those who doubted him. "Let me get this straight," the judge scoffed, tilting his head. "You, a disabled veteran, think you can represent yourself in court against one of the top legal teams in the country?" The lawyers on the other side smirked, their expensive suits reflecting the bright courtroom lights. The old man, James Calloway, sat still, his weathered hands resting on the arms of his wheelchair. His expression remained unreadable, but his silence only fueled the mockery. Judge Lancaster chuckled and leaned back in his chair. "This should be good," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for the courtroom to hear. "Let's see what kind of legal genius a man who spent his life holding a rifle instead of a law book has to offer." Laughter filled the room again. People whispered among themselves, shaking their heads at the absurdity of it all. James slowly wheeled himself forward. The air in the room shifted. His brown eyes, sharp as a hawk's, met the judge's gaze. Then, in a voice both calm and commanding, he said, "Your Honor, with all due respect, I suggest you buckle up, because by the time I'm done here, you'll see exactly why underestimating me was the biggest mistake of your life." A heavy silence fell over the courtroom. The smirks faded. The judge stiffened. The lawyers exchanged glances. Something was off. Something told them they had just made a terrible mistake. The story truly began 2 months earlier. James sat alone on his porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. His small, worn-down house sat at the edge of a quiet neighborhood. Life after the military had not been kind to him. His wheelchair squeaked as he moved slightly, stretching his sore arms. He had lost the use of his legs in combat, but he had never let it define him. The real battle, he had come to learn, wasn't fought on foreign soil. It was fought in life itself. A letter lay on the small table beside him. He had read it a dozen times, yet he still couldn't believe it. A lawsuit. A powerful real estate company was trying to take away his home. They claimed he had violated some obscure property law, and now they were using their wealth and influence to push him out. James clenched his jaw. This wasn't just a house. This was the only thing he had left. This was where his wife, God rest her soul, had spent her final days. This was where he had built a life after returning from war. And now, some arrogant men in suits wanted to rip it away from him. Not on his watch. The following morning, he made his way to the local law office, seeking help. "I'm sorry, sir, but this case is too big for us," the lawyer said, shaking his head. "They have the best attorneys in the country. You'd need a miracle to win." James nodded, though disappointment weighed heavy on his heart. He visited another lawyer, then another, and another. The answer was always the same. Too powerful, too expensive, no chance. By the end of the day, he sat alone on a park bench, staring at the lawsuit papers in his hands. His wheelchair felt heavier than ever. That's when he made the decision. If no lawyer would stand with him, he would stand alone. He would fight this battle himself. The next few weeks were brutal. James turned his small living room into a war room. Stacks of law books, court case files, and notes covered every surface. He spent every waking hour studying, memorizing legal terms, reading about property rights. Night after night, he worked, fueled by nothing but sheer determination. The process wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt, moments of frustration. His old war injuries ached from exhaustion. But he pushed through. One evening, his neighbor, Emma, a kind-hearted schoolteacher, knocked on his door. "Mr. Calloway, you need to rest," she said, glancing at the mess of papers on the table. "I can't," James replied, rubbing his tired eyes. "If I stop now, I lose everything." She sighed, but there was admiration in her eyes. "Then at least let me help." And so, Emma became his research partner. Every night, she read through complicated legal documents, breaking them down into simpler terms. With her help, James's understanding of the law sharpened. Day by day, he grew stronger, smarter. He wasn't just learning the law. He was mastering it. The night before his court date, he sat staring at his reflection in the mirror. The man looking back at him wasn't just an old soldier. He was something more. He was a warrior preparing for battle. And this time, the battlefield was a courtroom. The morning of the trial arrived. James rolled into the courthouse, wearing his military uniform. The moment he entered, people stared. Whispers followed. Is he seriously representing himself? He doesn't stand a chance. But James didn't care. He wheeled himself to the defendant's table, feeling the weight of the moment. Across from him sat a team of high-powered lawyers, all dressed in designer suits. Their lead attorney, a smug-looking man named Christopher Vaughn, barely acknowledged him. Then, Judge Lancaster entered the courtroom. The gavel slammed. "Let's begin," the judge said. Vaughn rose, smirking. "Your Honor, we believe this case is clear. Mr. Calloway is in violation of the law, and we demand immediate action to remove him from the property." James remained silent. He could feel the condescension in the man's voice. Then, the judge turned to him. "And you, Mr. Calloway? You're choosing to represent yourself?" James nodded. That was the moment Judge Lancaster leaned forward, smirking. That was the moment he mocked him. That was the moment the entire courtroom laughed. And that was the moment James Calloway, with unwavering confidence, promised them all. They were in for the shock of their lives. The air in the courtroom was thick with arrogance. The wealthy lawyers, the judge's condescending smirk, the quiet chuckles from the audience. Everything in that moment screamed one undeniable truth. They had already decided. James Calloway was going to lose. But James knew something they didn't. He knew that the law wasn't just about money, power, or influence. It was about knowledge. And for the past few months, he had buried himself in it. He adjusted his wheelchair, cleared his throat, and then spoke. "Your Honor, before we proceed, I'd like to ask the plaintiff's counsel a few questions." Judge Lancaster rolled his eyes. "This is highly unusual." "Objection," Christopher Vaughn interrupted, not even bothering to hide his smirk. "We don't need to waste time on this." James remained calm. "It's a simple question. If they're so confident in their case, it shouldn't be a problem, right?" Vaughn frowned. Judge Lancaster sighed. "Proceed, but keep it brief." James turned to Vaughn, his voice steady. "Mr. Vaughn, under which statute is your client claiming I'm in violation?" Vaughn blinked. The question was too direct, too precise. He hesitated. "Well, under multiple property codes and municipal." "Which one specifically?" James pressed. "I assume a lawyer of your caliber wouldn't bring a case without a firm legal basis. Can you cite the exact code?" Silence. A few murmurs rippled through the crowd. Vaughn's lips tightened. "Of course we can. We just don't need to get into that level of detail right now." James let out a small smile. "Oh, I think we do." Judge Lancaster shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Calloway, this is not an interrogation." "Your Honor," James said, his voice unwavering. "This man is trying to take my home from me. I have every right to ensure the law is being applied correctly." The judge didn't like it, but he couldn't argue. "Fine. Continue." James turned back to Vaughn. "Mr. Vaughn, I'll ask again. Cite the exact law that states I'm in violation." Vaughn cleared his throat, flipping through a thick binder. His fingers moved quickly, searching for the exact section. James leaned back, waiting. Seconds passed, then a full minute. The silence became unbearable. Finally, Vaughn gritted his teeth. "We'll provide that information later." James's smile widened. "So you filed this lawsuit without knowing the exact law I supposedly violated?" Laughter rippled through the courtroom. Vaughn's face turned red. "This is ridiculous." "Of course we know." "Then say it." James interrupted, his voice cutting through the noise like a knife. Vaughn had nothing. James had just exposed him. The smirk on Judge Lancaster's face disappeared. His fingers tapped against the desk, annoyed. "Mr. Vaughn," the judge said, "I expect you to have your legal citations ready by the next session." Vaughn muttered under his breath, clearly furious. James remained calm. Step 1, shake their confidence. Step 2, prove they were bluffing. And now, it was time for Step 3. James slowly turned back toward the judge. "Your Honor, if I may, I have a few things I'd like to present." Judge Lancaster narrowed his eyes. "Go on." James reached into the folder on his lap and pulled out a stack of papers. "This," he said, holding them up, "is a record of my property deed. Signed, stamped, and legally approved 25 years ago." He handed it to the clerk, who brought it to the judge. Judge Lancaster skimmed it, his expression unreadable. James continued. "And this," he pulled out another document, "is a record showing every property tax payment I've made since then. Paid in full. On time. No violations." Another paper was handed over. Judge Lancaster's frown deepened. And finally, James said, his voice now carrying weight, this is a copy of the original zoning law they claim I violated. He paused for dramatic effect. Except there's a problem. Vaughn shifted in his seat. The law they're using to evict me, James said, was passed 3 years after I bought my house. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Vaughn's jaw clenched. Judge Lancaster flipped through the document, reading it carefully. James let the silence hang in the air before delivering the final blow. Which means, Your Honor, that not only is their case built on nothing, but even if I had violated their so-called law, it wouldn't apply to me. Because the law doesn't work backward. For the first time that day, Judge Lancaster looked shaken. Vaughn's face was pale. The courtroom buzzed with excitement. People whispered, some nodding, others murmuring in disbelief. James sat back, satisfied. He had just done what nobody thought was possible. He had outmaneuvered some of the best lawyers in the country, using nothing but his own knowledge. And he wasn't done yet. Before the judge could respond, Vaughn shot to his feet. Your Honor, I demand a recess. Why? James asked, tilting his head. So you can find a law that actually applies? More laughter from the courtroom. Judge Lancaster sighed, rubbing his temple. Fine. We'll reconvene tomorrow morning. He slammed his gavel. And just like that, the courtroom emptied. But as James rolled toward the exit, he caught Vaughn whispering furiously into his phone. Something told him this fight wasn't over yet. And he was right. Because the next morning, things were about to get a whole lot worse. The next morning, James rolled into the courtroom expecting resistance. He was prepared for legal tricks, procedural delays, maybe even a desperate new argument from Vaughn and his team. What he didn't expect was the police waiting for him. 2 officers stood at the entrance of the courtroom, their hands resting on their belts, their eyes locked onto him the moment he entered. Something was wrong. Mr. Calloway, one of them said, stepping forward. We need to speak with you outside. The entire courtroom went silent. People turned, whispering among themselves. James frowned. Is there a problem, officer? The cop's jaw tightened. We have reason to believe you've engaged in fraudulent activity regarding your property documents. We need you to come with us for questioning. Gasps rippled through the crowd. James's heart pounded, but he kept his face neutral. Fraud. This was an obvious setup. His eyes flicked to the plaintiff's table. Richard Vaughn was smirking, arms folded, as if he had already won. James took a slow breath, forcing himself to stay calm. He wasn't some scared old man they could intimidate. Officer, if you have evidence of fraud, I'd love to see it, James said, his voice steady, controlled. The cop hesitated. We, received an anonymous tip that your documents were forged. An anonymous tip? James almost laughed. Vaughn wasn't even trying to be subtle. Officer, James said, his voice sharp, do you have a warrant for my arrest? The officer shifted uncomfortably. No, sir, but we'd prefer if you came with us voluntarily. And if I say no? The officer clenched his jaw. Then we'll have to escalate this further. James's eyes flicked to the judge. Your Honor, he said, his voice unwavering. Are you really going to allow this? You saw my documents yesterday. Are you suggesting they're forged? Judge Lancaster leaned forward, rubbing his chin, his expression unreadable. Vaughn stood up. Your Honor, I think it's best if we put this trial on hold while these very serious allegations are investigated. James saw right through the plan. They weren't trying to prove fraud. They were trying to stall the trial long enough for their company to force him out of his home while he was tied up in legal nonsense. It was a dirty, underhanded move. And James wasn't about to let it happen. Your Honor, James said, I request an immediate review of these so-called fraud allegations. If I leave this courtroom now, I may not be able to return before my eviction is processed. And that, I believe, is exactly what Mr. Vaughn wants. Vaughn stiffened. Objection. Overruled, Judge Lancaster muttered. For the first time, the judge actually seemed annoyed. Not at James. At Vaughn. That was interesting. Judge Lancaster turned to the officers. Unless you have concrete evidence against Mr. Calloway, I'm not stopping these proceedings. The officers hesitated. They exchanged a glance. Then, finally, they stepped back. James didn't move. He held his ground. And he won. The officers turned and left, clearly irritated. The moment the doors shut behind them, James rolled his wheelchair forward, looking Vaughn dead in the eye. That was sloppy, he said. Vaughn's jaw tightened, his confidence finally cracking. And James wasn't done. You came here thinking I'd be an easy target, he continued, his voice carrying through the silent courtroom. That I'd roll over and let you take my home without a fight. His eyes burned into Vaughn's. But what you didn't expect, what none of you expected, was that I would come prepared. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. James leaned forward. Tell me, Mr. Vaughn, do you really think you can outmaneuver me? Because so far, you're not doing a very good job. Vaughn slammed his hands onto the table. Your Honor, this is ridiculous. This man is making a mockery of the court. Judge Lancaster raised a hand, silencing him. His face was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes. A flicker of respect. Before anyone could say another word, the judge sighed and turned toward James. Mr. Calloway, he said, do you have any additional evidence to present? James smiled. As a matter of fact, Your Honor, I do. He reached into his folder and pulled out yet another document. A very important document. This, he said, handing it over to the clerk, is a legal precedent from a Supreme Court case that directly contradicts the plaintiff's argument. A ripple of shock passed through the courtroom. Vaughn flinched. The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. James continued, his voice steady. This ruling clearly states that property laws cannot be retroactively applied to remove a homeowner from land they legally purchased before the law was enacted. He let that sink in. Which means that. Judge Lancaster held up a hand. He studied the document, reading it carefully. Then he sighed, rubbing his temple. Finally, he looked up and met Vaughn's gaze. Mr. Vaughn, the judge said, his voice tired. Is it true that your client's case depends on a zoning law passed after Mr. Calloway bought his property? Vaughn hesitated. He was trapped. He knew he was trapped. His only options were to admit the truth or try to spin a lie in front of the entire courtroom. For the first time, he looked nervous. The confidence, the arrogance, the smugness, all of it was gone. Judge Lancaster waited. The room held its breath. And then, finally, Vaughn muttered through clenched teeth. Yes. Gasps filled the courtroom. Judge Lancaster sighed heavily, shaking his head. Then I don't see how this case can proceed, the judge muttered. We will reconvene after I review this precedent. Vaughn sat down hard, looking as if he had been punched in the gut. Meanwhile, James. He sat tall in his wheelchair, watching as the entire courtroom began to realize the truth. This old, disabled veteran wasn't just fighting back. He was winning. And Vaughn, he wasn't going to take that lightly. Because the next move Vaughn made would be his most desperate one yet. The courthouse halls buzzed with murmurs as James wheeled himself outside, Emma walking beside him. The moment Judge Lancaster delayed the case to review the Supreme Court precedent, the energy in the courtroom had shifted. For the first time, people were beginning to believe that James might actually win. But James knew better. Vaughn wouldn't accept this loss. Not easily. Not quietly. And he was right. Because as he reached the bottom of the courthouse steps, he heard a voice behind him. You think you're smart, old man? James stopped his wheelchair. Slowly, he turned. Richard Vaughn stood at the top of the steps. His tie was slightly loosened, his jaw clenched. His usual smug confidence was gone. In its place was something uglier. Anger, frustration, desperation. Emma stepped in front of James. Back off, Vaughn. Vaughn let out a cold laugh. Oh, I'm the bad guy now. Do you have any idea what you've done? He pointed at James. You just embarrassed one of the biggest real estate firms in the country. You think they're going to let that slide? James didn't blink. Are you threatening me, Mr. Vaughn? Vaughn smirked. Oh no. No threats. He took a step closer. I'm just warning you. There are other ways to win a case besides the courtroom. Emma tensed. You can't intimidate him. This case is already falling apart, and you know it. Vaughn chuckled darkly. You still don't get it, do you? He shook his head. The law doesn't matter when you have power, when you have money. His voice dropped to a low, taunting whisper. We own judges. We own officials. You think your little war hero act is going to change that? James's expression didn't change. But deep inside, something burned. Not with fear, with determination. He had faced men like Vaughn before. Not in courtrooms. In war zones. Men who believed their power made them invincible. And he knew how to handle them. Slowly, James wheeled himself forward. He stopped just inches away from Vaughn and looked him dead in the eye. Let me tell you something, son, he said, his voice low but firm. I've seen men like you before. Vaughn swallowed but said nothing. I've seen bullies who think their money makes them untouchable. James leaned in. And do you know what happens to them? A muscle in Vaughn's jaw twitched. They fall, James continued, his voice steady. Because they underestimate the wrong person. For a brief moment, Vaughn's mask cracked. James saw it. Doubt. Fear. But then Vaughn exhaled sharply, forcing a smile. We'll see about that, he muttered. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd of reporters who had gathered near the steps. Emma let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. James, that man is dangerous. I know, James said. Then why did you push him like that? James turned his wheelchair, heading toward his car. Because men like him only understand one thing. Emma frowned. And what's that? James's grip tightened on his wheels. Resistance. He wheeled himself up the ramp of his van. And I don't plan on giving him an inch. But deep down, he knew it. Vaughn was about to make his next move. And it was going to be worse than anything he had tried before. James sat in his dimly lit living room, legal documents spread across the table. Emma sat beside him, sipping coffee as she flipped through case files. All right, she said. So we know their legal case is weak. We just have to hold the line until the judge rules in your favor. James nodded. Which means, she continued, they'll try something outside the courtroom. Like what? Emma didn't answer immediately. But James already knew. When powerful men were backed into a corner, they became desperate. And desperate men were dangerous. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed outside. Emma jumped. What was that? James wheeled himself toward the window. He peered outside, his sharp eyes scanning the darkness. Then he saw it. Spray-painted in giant red letters across his garage door were the words, "Get out or else." Emma covered her mouth. Oh my God. James remained still, his expression unreadable. But his grip on the armrest of his wheelchair tightened. Emma turned to him. We need to call the police. James exhaled. And tell them what? That some coward with a spray can decide to threaten me? They won't do anything until something actually happens. Emma crossed her arms. And what if something does happen? James didn't answer. He didn't have to. They both knew. The fight was far from over. And Vaughn. He had just made it personal. James pulled into the courthouse parking lot, his mind sharp and focused. But the moment he rolled out of his van, he noticed something. A small crowd had gathered near the entrance. Reporters. Onlookers. Even some police officers. Something was wrong. Emma, who had just arrived, ran up to him. James, she said, breathless. You need to see this. She handed him her phone. The screen displayed a news article from just an hour ago. Breaking. New evidence suggests disabled veteran James Calloway may have forged his property deed. James's blood ran cold. The article continued. According to a new investigation, documents provided by Mr. Calloway may contain inconsistencies that suggest potential fraud. While no charges have been filed, sources close to the case indicate that authorities are looking into the matter. If proven true, this could result in serious legal consequences for Mr. Calloway. James clenched his jaw. This was Vaughn's doing. Emma looked at him, her face pale. They're trying to turn public opinion against you. James took a slow breath. He had expected an attack, but he didn't think Vaughn would go this far. This wasn't just about winning a case anymore. Vaughn was trying to destroy him. But James had faced worse odds before. And if Vaughn thought this would scare him into backing down, he was about to learn just how wrong he was. Because James wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. The courtroom was packed. Journalists lined the back row, their cameras flashing. The article accusing James of forgery had spread like wildfire, and now the whole city was watching. James wheeled himself to his usual spot at the defense table. His face was calm, but his mind was sharp as steel. This wasn't just about his home anymore. This was about proving the truth. Judge Lancaster entered, his expression unreadable. He tapped his gavel. Court is now in session. Before James could even speak, Richard Vaughn stood up, his smirk back in place. Your Honor, before we proceed with today's hearing, I have an urgent request. Lancaster sighed. Go on. Vaughn picked up a thick folder and held it dramatically. We have uncovered disturbing new information that calls into question the legitimacy of Mr. Calloway's property deed. Murmurs spread through the room. Reporters scribbled notes. James remained still. Lancaster frowned. Mr. Vaughn, you're making a serious accusation. Do you have concrete evidence? Vaughn smiled like a wolf. Absolutely. He handed the folder to the clerk, who passed it to the judge. Lancaster flipped through it, his eyes scanning the pages. A tense silence filled the room. After a minute, the judge looked up. This is interesting. Vaughn adjusted his tie, confidence radiating from him. The documents provided by Mr. Calloway show discrepancies in the notary's signatures. There are irregularities in the stamp placement. These aren't just minor errors, Your Honor. These are hallmarks of forgery. Gasps rippled through the audience. Emma, sitting in the front row, covered her mouth in shock. James didn't move. He had spent weeks preparing for this battle. And now, Vaughn had thrown his hardest punch. It was time to hit back. Your Honor, James said, his voice strong. May I examine these so-called discrepancies? Lancaster nodded and motioned for the clerk to hand him the papers. James took his time, scanning each page, flipping through every detail. Then he chuckled, loud enough for the whole courtroom to hear. Vaughn's smugness faded slightly. Something funny, Mr. Calloway? James placed the papers down. Yes, very funny. He looked directly at the judge. Your Honor, would you like to know why this forgery accusation is absolute nonsense? Lancaster raised an eyebrow. Please, enlighten us. James leaned forward. The irregular stamp placement? That's because these documents were scanned and resized by the county office when they were digitally archived. The slight shifts in stamp position aren't fraud. They're the result of standard document processing. Vaughn flinched. James continued. And the notary signatures? Of course, they're slightly different, because this deed has been re-recorded multiple times over the years. Every time property taxes were adjusted or payments were updated, the office verified and restamped the original deed. Any minor variation is simply the result of decades of legal upkeep. Lancaster flipped back through the documents, comparing the dates. Then he nodded. He's right. Gasps filled the courtroom. Vaughn's face turned red. That doesn't prove anything. Oh, but it does, James interrupted. Because if you actually knew anything about property law, you would have realized that before wasting this court's time. Laughter erupted in the audience. Even Judge Lancaster looked amused. Vaughn's jaw clenched. He turned back to the judge. Your Honor, I still believe a full investigation is necessary before proceeding. Lancaster sighed, rubbing his temple. Mr. Vaughn, you accused a decorated veteran of forging his own home deed based on an ignorance of basic document processing. Unless you have actual proof of criminal activity, I suggest we move on. Vaughn opened his mouth, then shut it. He had lost. Again. James sat back in his wheelchair, watching his opponent with quiet satisfaction. They had tried to break him in court. They had tried to turn the public against him. And they had failed. But just as things seemed to settle, something unexpected happened. Lancaster tapped his gavel. Since the plaintiff's argument has been severely weakened, I am considering a motion to dismiss. Silence. A motion to dismiss meant the case would be thrown out entirely. Vaughn shot to his feet. Objection. We need time to review these claims. James's eyes narrowed. Vaughn was stalling. And that's when it hit him. Vaughn didn't care about winning in court anymore. He just needed time. But why? Then, as if to answer his question, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Emma leaned forward, whispering urgently. James, it's bad. She handed him her phone. His stomach dropped. It was a breaking news alert. Judge moves to dismiss lawsuit against disabled veteran. Meanwhile, Calloway's home is being demolished, right now. The blood drained from James's face. His house. His home. They weren't waiting for a court ruling. They were taking it by force. And they were doing it right now. James gripped his wheelchair wheels, his heart pounding. Vaughn smirked. Oh, he said casually, something wrong. James's hands clenched into fists. The battle wasn't in the courtroom anymore. It was happening outside. And if they thought he was going to sit there and let them destroy everything he had left, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. James didn't waste another second. Without waiting for the judge's ruling, he spun his wheelchair around and wheeled himself toward the exit as fast as he could. Emma was right behind him, struggling to keep up. James, slow down. There's no time. His voice was sharp, urgent. His heart pounded in his chest. His home, his entire life was on the verge of being wiped out. And he was stuck in a courthouse while it happened. The second they burst through the courtroom doors, reporters swarmed them. Mr. Calloway, do you have a response to the allegations? How do you feel about your case possibly being dismissed? Are you aware your house is already being demolished? That last question hit like a gunshot. James's head snapped toward the reporter who said it. The man held up his phone, showing a live video feed. The footage was shaky, but clear enough to see. A bulldozer, a wrecking crew, people in suits standing off to the side, watching. His house, his wife's favorite rose bushes, his front porch, the place where he had spent years rebuilding his life, was already half gone. James's vision went red. No, 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 no. He pushed harder, rolling toward the parking lot. Emma ran ahead, yanking open the passenger door of James's van. Come on, we can still make it. James wheeled up the ramp, his hands moving on pure adrenaline. The second he was inside, Emma floored it. The van screeched onto the street, weaving through traffic at a speed that would have given James a heart attack if he wasn't already running on rage. Emma gripped the wheel, her knuckles white. James, this is illegal. They can't do this while the case is still open. James's jaw clenched. They don't care. He exhaled sharply. Vaughn knew he couldn't win in court. So he's pulling this stunt to get rid of me before the law catches up to him. Emma gritted her teeth. Then we'll catch up to him first. The van tore down the street, closing the distance to James's house. But the closer they got, the worse the sinking feeling in his gut became. This wasn't just about a home anymore. This was about justice. And someone was about to pay. By the time they reached his neighborhood, the destruction was in full swing. A massive construction truck blocked part of the street, making it clear this had been planned in advance. Workers in neon vests were tearing down what remained of the porch. The bulldozer loomed ominously near the last standing wall of his house. And there, standing off to the side, looking perfectly smug in his designer suit, was Richard Vaughn. The second James saw him, something inside him snapped. Emma slammed on the brakes. We're here. We have to stop them. James didn't wait. He flung open the van door and wheeled himself out, rage propelling him forward. Stop! His voice thundered over the sound of machinery. Heads turned. The workers hesitated, uncertain. The operator of the bulldozer lifted his hand, signaling for the crew to pause. And that was when Vaughn turned. He smiled. Ah, Mr. Calloway, he said, hands in his pockets. You're just in time to watch history being made. James rolled right up to him, stopping mere inches away. Vaughn chuckled. I assume you heard the news. James's voice was low, deadly. You have no legal right to do this. Oh, but I do. Vaughn pulled a piece of paper from his pocket and unfolded it slowly, like he was savoring the moment. This, he said, waving it, is an emergency demolition order citing immediate hazard concerns. James's stomach tightened. I pulled a few strings, Vaughn continued. Turns out your home is dangerously unstable and needs to be removed for public safety. James's hands tightened on his wheels. You're lying. Vaughn shrugged. Maybe, maybe not. But by the time anyone challenges it in court, he gestured at the wreckage. Well, too late. Emma stormed forward. You can't do this. The case hasn't even been settled. Vaughn smirked. Oh, I think it has. Then he turned to the bulldozer operator and waved his hand. Finish the job. The engine roared to life. James's body moved before his brain did. With pure instinct, he launched himself forward, rolling directly into the path of the bulldozer. The crowd gasped. The bulldozer screeched to a halt, its massive blade just feet from James's chair. People started yelling. What's he doing? Get him out of there. James didn't move. His wheelchair sat directly in front of the machine. A single man against thousands of pounds of steel. The driver hesitated, looking around. Sir. Vaughn's face darkened. What are you waiting for? Move him. But the workers hesitated. Because something had changed. People were watching. Not just reporters, but neighbors. Passers-by, folks who had seen James in this town for years. And right now, he wasn't just fighting for his home. He was fighting for something bigger. A movement was starting, a stand against corruption. And Vaughn knew it. James's voice rang out, strong and defiant. This is my home, and I will not let you take it from me. Vaughn's fists clenched. He looked at the bulldozer driver. Go. The driver hesitated. Then, he turned off the engine. Vaughn's face twisted with rage. What are you doing? The driver wiped his hands on his vest. I signed up to build houses, not destroy them for some rich lawyer. The crowd erupted in cheers. Neighbors started stepping forward, moving toward James. Emma turned to the reporters. You're getting all of this, right? Cameras flashed. Vaughn was losing control. He turned desperately, looking for support. But the moment he did, something happened. A police car pulled up. Then another. And another. The sirens cut through the air. Judge Lancaster stepped out of the lead car, his expression furious. Vaughn paled. Vaughn. The judge's voice boomed. I just got off the phone with the county commissioner. He pointed at the wreckage. This demolition is illegal. Vaughn opened his mouth, then shut it. I can explain. I bet you can, Lancaster said coldly. He turned to the officers. "Arrest him." Gasps. The officers moved fast. "Wait. You can't." Vaughn's protests were cut short as his hands were yanked behind his back. The cold steel of handcuffs clicked into place. The crowd cheered. James closed his eyes, letting the moment wash over him. He had won. He had finally won. As Vaughn was dragged away, Emma kneeled beside James's chair, smiling. "You did it." James exhaled. "No." He looked around at the people standing behind him. "We did it." And for the first time in a long time, he felt truly home. Bright Future Developments collapsed. Their assets were frozen. Their top executives faced criminal charges. And as for James, he was awarded full ownership of his land. But that wasn't the real victory. The real victory was justice. Not just for him, but for everyone they had wronged. That evening, as the sun set, James sat outside the remains of his home. Emma sat beside him on the front steps, or what was left of them, shaking her head. "I still can't believe it. They were actually trying to tear it down while we were still in court." James sighed, running a hand over his face. Vaughn was never trying to win legally. He just needed me gone before the law caught up to him. Emma frowned. "Well, it caught up real fast." James smirked. "It did. And now, Vaughn would have to answer for all of it. The fraud, the illegal demolition attempt, the lies." But as much as James wanted to revel in the victory, he knew the battle wasn't truly over. Because while Vaughn was out of the picture, the real estate company wasn't. And something told him they weren't done yet. James woke up to a familiar sound. A knock on the door. Not his front door, because that was mostly rubble, but the temporary trailer door his neighbors had loaned him. He opened it to find a man in a dark suit standing there, briefcase in hand. "Mr. Calloway?" James studied him, instantly wary. "Depends. Who's asking?" The man smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "My name is Charles Whitmore. I represent Bright Future Developments." James's grip on his wheelchair tightened. "Here we go." Whitmore adjusted his tie. "May I come in?" "No." The man hesitated, but quickly recovered. "All right then. I'll keep this brief." He reached into his briefcase, pulled out a contract, and placed it on a clipboard. $500,000. James's heart slowed. Whitmore tapped the paper. $500,000. In cash. He smiled. "All you have to do is sign this contract, hand over the deed, and walk away. No lawsuits. No further action. You'll have enough to buy a new house anywhere you want. Maybe even a fresh start." James stared at the contract. It was tempting, but then he looked at his land, his home, and he remembered why he had fought so hard in the first place. Slowly, he looked back at Whitmore and smirked. "Take your offer." He shoved the clipboard back toward him. "And get out."